Have you ever felt like you're caught in an absolute storm when it comes to your relationships? You know, swinging wildly between caring way too much and then suddenly feeling completely, entirely numb? Well, in this explainer, we're going to unpack exactly why that happens and, more importantly, how to finally find our emotional center. Let's dive into what drives this emotional pendulum. So this brings us to a really powerful concept. There is actually a very well-known book in the Arab world titled Fakh at-Ta'alluq, which translates to the trap of attachment. And honestly, that word trap is just perfectly chosen. We really need to ask ourselves right now, are you caught in this trap? Do you find yourself stuck in this painful, repetitive cycle of emotional dependency, where your entire sense of well-being is completely dictated by another person's actions or moods? It's a heavy question for sure, but recognizing that feeling of being trapped, that is the absolute first step toward breaking free. Consider this clinical observation. It states, when the obsession for another person reaches such a degree that the individual no longer cares about their own needs, even their own life. That really validates just how dark, consuming, and genuinely dangerous this attachment trap can become when it starts to spiral. We're not just talking about having a crush here or being a little clingy. No, we are talking about an obsession so heavy that it literally erases a person's most basic instinct for self-preservation. Clinically speaking, this whole hyper-attachment phenomenon is known as affective dependency or anxious attachment. It's a very specific type of insecure attachment that combines three things: intense emotional distress, deeply rooted in low self-esteem, and this insatiable constant need for reassurance from another person. So we're setting our baseline right here, on the far edge of the emotional pendulum. This is exactly what it looks like when our absolute need for connection overrides our basic sense of self. Now, this complex trap doesn't just appear out of thin air. It is essentially a perfect storm. At the top level, we have socio-environmental factors, things like early trauma or neglect, mixing right in with our genetics, and all of it is steeped in societal and cultural expectations. These elements combine to precipitate insecure attachment and low self-esteem. What this proves is that this isn't some random character flaw. It is a deeply rooted structural response to the world around us. To really drive that home, let's look at the biology for a second, because it is wild. Early childhood trauma or emotional neglect can literally leave epigenetic scars on your prefrontal limbic circuits. That's basically your brain's emotional control center. Surprisingly, it even alters your oxytocin. Now, we normally call that the cuddle hormone, right? But here, it actually turns your drive for connection into a source of panic. On top of that, it dysregulates your CRH axis. It essentially breaks your body's stress thermostat, meaning your nervous system is just permanently wired on high alert for abandonment. Okay, so how does this biological storm actually play out in daily life? Well, it creates a brutal cognitive behavioral loop. Let's use a scenario I think we can all relate to. Step 1, a trigger. You send a text to your partner and they don't reply for 3 hours. Step 2, the anxious thought pops up. They're losing interest in me. Step 3, emotional distress. Panic sets in, your heart literally starts racing. Step 4, reactive behavior. You send 5 more text messages in a row, just desperately seeking some reassurance. And finally, step 5, reinforced fear. The tension this creates in the relationship, it just confirms your initial underlying fear of abandonment. It is an absolutely exhausting, vicious cycle. You know, pop culture really loves to romanticize passion and intense love. Think of almost every romantic movie you've ever seen where a character dramatically declares they can't live without someone. But we actually must pause here. Staying trapped in this hyper-attached state is not romantic. It carries incredibly severe real-world consequences that can completely derail a person's entire life. The grim reality is that when you have zero emotional boundaries, you become incredibly vulnerable. Clinical data actually shows that affective dependency acts as a literal breeding ground for domestic violence, both psychological and physical, because the dependent person is just terrified to leave. We also see clinical depression rates spike up to a staggering 31% in dependent personalities, right alongside a high risk of eating disorders, somatic issues, and severe addictive behaviors. This extreme side of the pendulum is genuinely, truly dangerous to your health. So, having explored the painful depths of that affective dependency, what does the human brain do to protect itself? I mean, if caring too much hurts this badly, what's the logical defense mechanism? Simple. We swing the pendulum completely to the exact opposite extreme. We start looking at emotional detachment as this misguided protective shield. Basically, we try to feel absolutely nothing at all. But we have to draw a really clear line in the sand right here. There is a massive, massive difference between healthy detachment and excessive detachment. Healthy detachment is an amazing skill. It's observing your emotions with compassion without letting them control your behavior. Like you acknowledge you're angry, but you don't pick up a chair and throw it, right? Excessive detachment, however, is suppressing, ignoring, and entirely denying your feelings. It's building a fortress around yourself so thick that absolutely nothing gets in and nothing gets out.
And just like dependency, this extreme has some pretty severe consequences of its own. Pushing detachment too far doesn't actually protect you. Those unexpressed emotions, they don't just magically vanish, they get physically trapped in your body. This leads to intense psychosomatic pain. We're talking things like chronic migraines, severe back pain, unexplained abdominal aches. Furthermore, it creates this deep social coldness. It completely destroys your interpersonal relationships because you become entirely incapable of authentic connection or resolving even normal relationship conflicts. You just end up isolating yourself completely.
So, if we can't survive on the extreme edge of anxious attachment and we slowly destroy ourselves on the other edge of emotional detachment, what do we do? How do we actually halt this wild swinging? How do we stop the pendulum to find a secure, resilient emotional center? Synthesizing the clinical data, the good news is that rewiring the anxious or even the avoidant brain is possible, but it requires actionable tools. It starts with cognitive behavioral therapy, using things like thought records to catch those distorted beliefs in real time, right before they spiral out of control. Then we have to physically calm the nervous system down with targeted mindfulness and deep breathing. But maybe most importantly, it requires actively restoring your self-esteem and setting firm, absolutely unyielding boundaries. And please remember, you don't have to rebuild your emotional house all by yourself. Utilizing support groups like Depressives and Addicts Anonymous or online therapy platforms provides that necessary community scaffolding to keep you grounded. You now understand the biology, the cognitive loops, and the very severe risks of both extremes. You know that finding that middle ground requires conscious, daily practice. So the question remains for you. What is one single boundary you can set today, or one anxious thought you can actively challenge to step out of the trap and build a secure, balanced connection? Take a moment to really reflect on that and start taking those steps today.